Hi guys, I hope you're doing okay and that you're trying to stay as positive as possible. Now, today I want to move on to the third poem by Adrienne Rich. The first poem that we looked at, remember, was Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. The second one was Living in Sin. And both poems, then, of course, are associated with the 1950s. So remember that Rich's style is evolving and changing then over the years. So if we're going to think about it, Living in Sin and Aunt Jennifer's Tigers are kind of general themes, okay, universal themes, but still quite general. Here we see a difference. From a Survivor is a very personal poem with a very personal theme. Okay, so some biographical details. Obviously, they're very, very important here. So, Adrienne Rich herself then was 24 when she married. Okay, so she married in 1953 and she married a fellow intellectual. So, he was an economist and he taught at Harvard University. So, basically, they got married then when they were in their 20s and they had three sons, three children together. But when it came to the late 1960s, society was undergoing a tremendous upheaval or change in terms of, we'd say, people's attitudes and people's behaviour. So there was a kind of a cultural revolution, essentially, and a sexual revolution when it came to the late 1960s. And Rich and Conrad found themselves then immersed in that. And they were both activists, essentially, when it came to the civil rights movement. So the rights of women, the rights of African Americans, and the rights of the LGBT community. Okay, so they had sort of shared values. They were both intellectuals, both from kind of similar backgrounds. They were both Jewish. They had compatible personalities, okay? So they were good friends or firm friends. And like I said, they were both activists as well. So both kind of liberals, very progressive and so on. But you have to kind of remember when Rich was growing up, there was no real mention or discussion of LGBT rights or sexuality, or in particular women's sexuality. So Rich's feelings towards her husband began to change when she began to realise that she was actually gay herself. So this led obviously to a fracture within their relationships. So a split within the relationship. Essentially, then they separated in 1970. They've been kind of growing apart for a few years. And they were still very much part of each other's lives because obviously they had their three children common, their three sons. But in 1970, then unfortunately, Alfred Conrad himself took his own life. So we do see Rich's reaction and response to that. First of all, the failure of their relationship, the breakdown of their marriage. And second of all, then, of course, the tragic circumstances of Alfred Conrad's premature death. So he died at the age of 46. Okay, so if we look at the title of the poem itself, From a Survivor, you could say it has a kind of a defiant tone essentially here. Okay, it's not celebratory, she's not being triumphant in any way. She's being sort of quietly confident and defiant here, and saying, of course, that no matter what she experiences in life, she will soldier on. She will continue, of course, to fight. So it's almost like a kind of a battle cry, essentially, but in a very understated way. That's not too much of a contradiction. So she's writing from the heart here, okay? She's being very sincere, very direct, and very honest about herself, about her own failures, about the circumstances of her marriage falling apart, and then she's being very hopeful about the future, okay? So it's, once more, a very personal poem, okay, but it has kind of like universal elements in it as well, because she's talking, of course, about the nature of marriage itself and the kind of expectations that people have when they get married, especially when they get married at a very young age as well, okay, and how that can be undermined and scuppered then by real life, by the kind of practical element of life itself. So think of the language here, think of the structure here as a definite evolution from Aunt Jennifer's Tigers to Living in Sin, and then this particular poem, From a Survivor. So it was published in 1973. So obviously Conrad took his own life in 1970. So she was writing this in the early 1970s. So she begins then, and she addresses him in the poem. The pact that we made was the ordinary pact of men and women in those days. Now, if you think about it, she's referring to her marriage here, the commitment as a pact. And you kind of think that word is very odd to use about a loving relationship or about a romantic relationship, because the word pact would suggest a deal or a bargain, essentially, an agreement or an arrangement. It's almost like we'd say a formal agreement or a treaty, even. It would suggest something that is, or something that has to do with the military, or something that has to do with politics as such then. So it seems like a very cold word to use. But maybe she's talking about the idea that back in the 1950s, you had, of course, a lot of pressure on people to settle down, to get married and to have children. So maybe some people just had a marriage of convenience, essentially, especially people who are still in the closet, people who are gay, or people who didn't even realize they were gay, essentially then. They felt obliged because of societal expectation and pressure to get married. Okay, so it's this particular notion then, of course, that that was the cultural norm, that was the expectation. So the word pact then would suggest that. And if you kind of think of the word pact, it does suggest the idea of a marriage contract, anyway, like a business transaction or some kind of compromise. It kind of suggests sort of the aftermath or the fallout of a war or a battle, though, as well. You know, the two sides come together and kind of negotiate a particular deal as to how they're going to move forward. But notice how she uses the word ordinary here. So she's saying it was very, very typical, very usual of those days, essentially, then, for people just to get married at a young age and to have children. That they never really contemplated what they were doing. They never really questioned those societal expectations or the customs, essentially, or duties, perhaps, as well. So the pact that we made was the ordinary pact of men and women in those days. So in those days, it was of its time. Back in the 1950s, of course, that's what people just did and people just accepted it. Notice how when she's writing men and women, she uses the ampersand. So she uses the symbol for and rather than the word and, A-N-D. And that might suggest the idea of a business, perhaps here. It's almost like a company or a firm, you know, sort of like Cooper and Co. or Jones and Son, essentially. Okay, so it's kind of reinforcing the idea then that it was almost like a formal arrangement, even though they did have a lot in common and they had those shared values and they respected each other. There was still that sense of, perhaps we say, a lack of warmth or a lack of romance, essentially then. And that would have coloured the relationship. So even though they were together for almost 20 years and married for about 16 or 17, there is that particular sense there that perhaps even in the early stages or even before they got married, there was still that sense perhaps that it wasn't the relationship that they assumed it was or that they thought it was. So she says, and notice of course the confessional tone here, I don't know who we thought we were. She's being very, very honest here. She's saying, well, maybe we were just foolish and naive. Maybe we were arrogant to expect, of course, that our relationship would work, that our relationship would survive the kind of trials and tribulations of life, the hardships, the difficulties. So I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. And kind of personality, I suppose, would kind of relate back to the idea that maybe they thought they were better than everyone else. Maybe they thought they were superior. Maybe as intellectuals, they thought, oh, well, we've freely chosen this. Of course, we're compatible. We have these shared values. This is going to be the perfect match, the perfect marriage as such. And think about it. I mean, all the studies today, of course, the report statistics would emphasize that at least 60% of marriages in America end in divorce. So in a way, of course, it's kind of hopeful, but it's also naive then to expect that you can buck the trend, that you can be different, that your marriage, of course, will stand the test of time. So when she says then that our personalities could resist the failures of the race here, I suppose, could just simply mean the human race, okay? That it's human nature, that is part of human life to fail, essentially. That we're all flawed creatures, and especially when you get two flawed creatures together in a marriage, then of course there is no guarantee that it's going to work out. The race, I suppose, could be a pun as well. If you kind of think of the idea of the voyage of life and all the different sort of pitfalls that would occur then throughout that particular voyage or journey then towards your inevitable destination. Okay, so she simply uses the word failure there just to be very honest and very sincere and very direct. about obviously her flaws and then the flawed nature of the relationship as well. Right, so when she says then in the next verse, lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order. So lucky, I suppose she's saying that we were still young and naive, and we didn't realize, of course, all the difficulties that we would have to deal with, that we would encounter on this journey together then within our marriage. So lucky then would suggest the idea that we were sort of like romantic and idealistic, perhaps, if we kind of think back to living in sin, there's a definite element there. And unlucky then, perhaps, of course, kind of foolish as such then, more towards the naive as well. So lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order. So perhaps we were lucky in that we didn't know exactly what marriage entailed. We had an idea of it, or maybe an idealized version of it. Or unlucky that we didn't know, that maybe we should have realized, maybe we should have thought carefully. Maybe we'd say other people should have been more honest about marriage and relationships. Because think about it, people did not really openly discuss romantic relationships or sexual relationships or marriage or the reality of marriage back then. It's only really now, of course, in the last kind of 20, 30 years that we know much more about it and that we're able to be open and we're able to be honest about our experiences and about our feelings. So she says, lucky or unlucky that we didn't know the race had failures of that order, of that kind, and that we were going to share them. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. And special, I suppose, would just simply mean unique or different. But maybe when she uses the word special, she's kind of suggesting superior as well, which relates back perhaps not just to a sense of naivety, but a sense maybe of arrogance. And maybe the arrogance of youth is emphasized here, that when you're young, of course, you think that everything will be perfect, that life will be easy, and that you don't really understand all of the difficulties and the challenges of life itself. And even when it comes to the romantic notion then of marriage, that you don't really know what lies in store for you and for the relationship itself. Okay, so remember, directly addressing her dead husband, which makes it much more impactful, much more intimate, and much more dramatic as well. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was. So think of vivid here, of course, would mean alive, kind of vital, very clear. So she has these very clear images of him. And if you kind of think about it, there is a sense, we'd say, maybe of guilt and remorse here, just in terms of how the relationship ended. And if we think back to the notion here of the body, she's kind of representing here how perhaps, and she used the image of a god later on, as to how the male body was viewed as opposed to the female body, and how women were supposed to be rather passive creatures and that men were supposed to be active creatures, especially when it came to intimacy and sex and sexuality as well. So your body is as vivid to me as it ever was. And this is a very respectful tone then as well. She's kind of talking about the memories that they shared, the life they had together, and maybe how the body itself then is naturally associated with the children that she had, her 3 sons, and how precious they are to her. So even more, since my feeling for it is clear. So we have the notion here, of course, of her being much more sensitive towards him and perhaps the nature, obviously, of his death. But also the idea, of course, that she's emphasizing how much she has changed, how her perception of men, how her perception of relationships, how her perception of her former husband has changed as well. So it's kind of the idea where throughout the marriage she was learning more about herself and learning more about what she wanted and what she needed, essentially, what would satisfy and fulfill her. So she says, I know what it could and could not do. So the idea is, of course, that yes, she thought they were compatible. Yes, she thought that they would be together forever, of course, this little microcosm, this perfect image, the perfect family. But now, of course, when she comes to terms with her own identity and her own sexuality, she realizes, of course, that she needs something different. She needs something more than that. It goes beyond what society is telling her what she should accept. So she says simply then, it is no longer the body of a god. And if you think about the image of a god, it's lowercase here rather than God as such. So a god is kind of associated with a kind of a mythical being or creature. Gods are associated with power and influence and strength. So she's saying, of course, that she just sees him as a man, a flawed man, just flesh and blood, essentially. That he was not something to be worshipped or even admired, respected, yes, but definitely not worshipped. That she no longer, of course, wants to devote herself to a man. Okay, so it's kind of emphasizing changing perspectives and changing perceptions and a changing worldview, essentially, as well. So it is no longer the body of a god, essentially, or anything with power over my life. So it's kind of emphasizing the idea then that her relationships with women are very different. It's about equality, essentially, there. It's not about one person kind of hero worshipping the other, or one person, of course, maybe we'd say dampening down her desires or her wants. Or maybe it's kind of the idea that within the relationship she was prioritizing him and his needs rather than her own. Next year it would have been 20 years and you're wastefully dead. So she's reminiscing. There's a hint of regret here. It's kind of wistful, essentially, just wishing that things could be better, wishing, of course, that he had not succumbed to suicide. So if we think the key phrase there, of course, excuse me, is wastefully dead. So if we think of the notion here that obviously he was an intelligent man, he was obviously a good father. Remember, of course, that they had quite a lot in common. They were very compatible in terms of personality or traits. So kind of the idea that he has wasted his potential, that he died, of course, at the age of 46, and he had so much more to offer, obviously in terms of his career, but even in terms of friendship, or even in terms as a father as well, and how much they've all been deeply affected by that, the entire family, Rich, and of course her children, or the extended family as well. So it's very poignant and very moving the way that she uses the adverb there, you are wastefully dead. So who might have made the leap? And think about a leap would suggest a kind of advancement. Remember that as a couple, of course, they were very liberal and very progressive. They were activists, of course. They were campaigning for change. And she's kind of saying that together as friends, we could have continued to campaign, to agitate, of course, for change, to make a difference within society, to change the world, however idealistic that may be. So she's saying who might have made the leap. Okay, think of a great advancement, a movement then. We talk too late of making, which I live now. So the idea is, of course, that she will continue the fight. She will continue to campaign. She will continue to protest. So now that his voice has been silenced forever, she will express her voice, her opinion, and agitate for that change. So she says then, I live it now, not as a leap, but a succession of brief, amazing moments. Now, if you think about it, what she's talking here about is she's talking about change. And if you think about it, most people who look for change or who protest or who agitate for change think that change is just going to arrive, like sweeping change just happens overnight. But the reality is, of course, that it happens incrementally. Tiny little baby steps, essentially, almost like stepping stones towards equality or towards freedom. So in a way, she's saying that she's kind of older and wiser when it comes to relationships, when it comes to herself, and when it comes to society. And she realizes, of course, that change takes a long time to come into effect. So it's just simply a succession then, kind of continuous image, almost like a chain or a link of brief, amazing moments. And this is the notion, of course, that she looks back over those 20 years and she realizes how far she has come, and she realizes how much has changed for her, but also how far society has come, how many advancements have been made in terms of social change and in terms of winning equality, of course, changing the laws, changing people's attitudes and behaviours. Now, it's interesting, in some books and in some versions, the word moments is actually movements. And if you think about it, it works just as well because you have a particular movement essentially that will look for change or campaign for change. So you could have like the LGBT plus, we say groups that are a movement then, of course, and they try their best, obviously, to make sure that society will change its laws. For example, think of America, of course, some states introduced same-sex marriage in 2011, in Ireland, of course, by popular vote in 2015. Okay, so it could be sort of a reference to that particular type of change, then changes within the law, as well as, of course, kind of societal norms and expectations. And then the very last line is each one making possible the next. So that relates back to the word succession there. Okay, there's a kind of a continuity when it comes to these particular changes, that one change happens, and it might be just a minor change, something small perhaps, and that leads on to something greater and then greater again. Okay, so the steps towards freedom, the steps towards equality then, of course, have to be sort of staggered, one after the other. Okay, so it's not just this giant leap, then they're just little baby steps or stepping stones towards freedom. And notice at the very end, then it's open-ended, a bit like Dickinson sometimes, the way that she does that. We don't have any punctuation mark at the very end. It just says each one making possible the next. And it's kind of emphasizing the idea, of course, that society will continue to change, that people will continue to change, that laws will change, that equality can be won over time. So you could say then that she's older and wiser, there's a hint of regret, but there's a sense of gratitude as well. And at the end of the poem then, it's very, very positive and it's very hopeful or optimistic. Right guys, so if you want to have a good look at that particular poem and obviously write out a few pointers in terms of style, anything that you've noticed, perhaps imagery, structure, language, maybe some of the references as well. If you want to write out a paragraph maybe on theme and just practice that. And then once I've finished Rich next week, then we can talk about exam questions and structuring one or two of those. Until then, take care.